This is Elias. You're listening to, well, you're not listening, are you? No one is. But the signal is still going out, for now. The generator outside has been groaning for 3 days. I think it's finally getting tired. I know the feeling. This is the last broadcast from Kestrel Point Observatory. The last broadcast of any kind, I imagine. There is nothing but silence on every other frequency. A profound, endless silence that has swallowed cities and continents. I've decided to use the last of the power not to scream for help, not to cry, or to curse the heavens, but to tell a story. Think of it as a lullaby. The end times lullaby. A story to soothe the world as it closes its eyes one last time. It's snowing outside. A thick, wet snow. It covers everything in a beautiful, clean blanket. It almost makes the world look peaceful again, but I know what's under it. I can hear them, even through the thick concrete walls of this place. A constant, shuffling pressure against the building. And the voices, a low, wet chorus of moans and groans. I call them the choir. They've been singing their one and only song for a long, long time. But it's the others I'm waiting for. The conductors. They'll be here soon. They always come when the power gets low. They're drawn to the silence that follows. So for the record, for the black box of planet Earth, if anyone should ever find it buried in the dust, my name is Elias Vance, and I was here. I saw it all, and this is how the world ended. Not with a bang, and not with a whimper, but with a song. Let's begin at the beginning, shall we? Back when we thought this was a fight we could win, before the whispers started, back when we were only fighting the dead. We called it the Age of Flesh. I don't know who came up with the name. It might have been me speaking into this very microphone late one night trying to put a label on the chaos. It helps, you know, to name a thing. It gives it boundaries. It makes it feel like something you can understand, something you can eventually defeat. We were so naive. The Age of Flesh. It sounds almost quaint to me now. A simpler time, a time of honest monsters. The enemy, you see, was understandable. They were a plague made manifest, a biological equation with a simple, horrifying solution. They were hungry, and we were food. They were slow, but they were relentless. They were us, stripped of everything but a single gnawing impulse. There was a brutal honesty to them. They didn't lie. They didn't whisper promises in the dark. They didn't wear the faces of your dead children to trick you into opening a door. They simply came, a tide of grasping hands and gnashing teeth, and we, for a time, held the line. It began, as these things so often do, as noise on the periphery, a news report from a small province in Southeast Asia, a quarantine, a communications blackout. The official story was a mutated strain of rabies, aggressive and fast-spreading. We've all seen those movies. We all knew the script. We watched the talking heads on 24-hour news channels debate the ethics of containment versus treatment. All while the fire was already burning down the walls of the world. I remember watching the first clear footage. It wasn't from a news helicopter or a military drone. It was from some tourist's phone, uploaded just before the local internet went dark. The video was shaky, the sound a mess of screams and sirens. But the image was unforgettable. A man in a police uniform, firing his sidearm into the chest of another man. The man falls. The officer turns, shouting at the camera, waving people away. And behind him, the man on the ground gets back up. He doesn't get up like a person. There's no effort, no struggle. He rises like a puppet being pulled by unseen strings, his body contorting at unnatural angles. He had a hole in his chest you could see the street through. But he was moving. He was hunting. The video cut out. The world went silent for a moment, and then the screaming started everywhere. My own station, Kestrel Point, we were mostly a music station back then. Classic rock, local news twice a day. I was the one who had to break the news to our little corner of the world. I read the first official bulletin from the emergency broadcast system. The words felt like stones in my mouth. An infectious agent of unknown origin. Reports of extreme aggression. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. It felt like a dream, a stupid, badly written horror movie. I followed the bulletin with a song by Creedence Clearwater Revival, Bad Moon Risin'. I thought it was a clever gallows humor kind of choice. I didn't understand. I didn't know what a bad moon really looked like. The first few weeks were a blur of denial and collapse. The military tried. God, they tried. We saw them on the news, clad in state-of-the-art gear, marching in perfect formation into the hearts of infected cities. We heard the sound of freedom, the roar of F-16s dropping payloads on swarming hordes in the streets of Chicago, of London, of Tokyo. For a while it seemed to work. They called it Operation Clean Slate. They established quarantine zones, massive walls of concrete and steel guarded by soldiers with orders to shoot anything that moved on the other side. They told us it was contained. They told us they were developing a cure. They lied. Or maybe they were just lying to themselves. We, in the media, we were part of it. We were the voice of that hope, that lie. I'd read the official PSAs, a 30-second guide to fortifying your home, know the signs of infection, fever, aggression, memory loss. This message brought to you by the Department of Homeland Security. We will prevail. I played patriotic music. I brought retired generals onto my show via satellite phone to talk about strategy and morale. I told people to be strong, to have faith in our leaders, in our soldiers. I was a good soldier, in my own way. I was selling hope, and for a while business was booming. The world shrank. Humanity pulled back, ceding the sprawling suburbs and the endless highways to the dead. We huddled in the fortified hearts of our cities, or in small, well-defended towns like Haven, which was the last bastion of hope in this state. We built walls. We learned the new rules of existence. 1. A bite is a death sentence. No exceptions. There is no cure, no antidote. There is only the bullet or the blade before the fever takes you. 2. They are drawn to sound. Silence is your shield. A dropped can, a car alarm, a crying baby, these were death sentences. 3. Remove the head or destroy the brain. It's the only way to be sure. Simple rules for a simple war. Life took on a new rhythm. It was a grim, brutal existence, but it was life. Communities formed behind the walls. We grew gardens on rooftops. We repurposed factories to make ammunition. We taught our children how to read and how to reload a rifle. Scavenging runs were the new form of commerce and exploration. A team would go out beyond the walls into the quiet, dead world to find medicine, fuel, canned goods. It was dangerous, of course, but the danger was known. You could plan for it. You wore thick leather to protect against bites. You moved slowly. You communicated with hand signals. You knew your enemy. You knew its limitations. It couldn't open doors. It couldn't climb ladders. It couldn't think. It just was. A force of nature, like a flood or a fire. And you could build levees against a flood. You could create fire breaks against a fire. I remember a story I reported on, one of the last good stories. A group of survivors from a small town 100 miles south of here. They were trying to evacuate a makeshift clinic, but a horde of a few thousand had them pinned down, drawn by the sound of the clinic's failing generator. They were out of options. But one of them, a high school science teacher, had an idea. They found the old town tornado siren, hooked it up to a truck battery, and put it on a timer. Then, a young woman, a former track star, took that siren, and she ran. She sprinted through the back alleys, leading that river of the dead away from the clinic, buying them the time they needed to escape. They said she was smiling when the horde finally caught her. She saved 37 people. Her name was Sarah. We played a song for her. A simple, heroic act in a world of simple, honest monsters. That was the age of flesh. It was a time of heroes and monsters, of clear lines drawn in the sand. But even then, the cracks were starting to show. The problem with the dead is that they have all the time in the world. They don't need to eat. They don't need to sleep. They don't get discouraged. They just press forward, a constant, grinding pressure on our walls, on our resources, on our sanity. For every one we put down, there were 2 more to take its place. We were a dwindling few, and they were a growing many. The attrition was unsustainable. We were losing. We were losing slowly, inch by bloody inch. But we were losing. The hope I had been selling on the airwaves began to feel thin, cheap. The patriotic songs sounded hollow. The generals I interviewed started to sound less like confident leaders and more like men trying to convince themselves. The world was getting quieter, not just because of the dead, but because the living were disappearing. One by one, the other radio stations I could reach went silent. A flicker of static where a voice used to be. The web of our new civilization was fraying. And then, something else began. It started in the spaces between things. A strange anomaly. In the static late at night, it wasn't a usual hiss and crackle. It was rhythmic, structured. It sounded like whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the product of exhaustion and fear. Then came the survivor reports, the ones that made no sense. A scavenging team from Haven called in, their voices tight with panic. They were hiding in a library, a horde outside. But they weren't scared of the horde. They were scared of one of them, one of the dead. It was standing in the middle of the street, not moving, not moaning, just watching the library. And they all swore, that it had spoken. It had said the name of their leader. I dismissed it. A shared hallucination, stress. But the reports kept coming. A shadow that moved against the light. A reflection in a window that smiled when you weren't. The rules, the simple, honest rules of our war, were starting to bend. They were starting to break. We had spent so long staring into the abyss of the dead, we never noticed something else was staring back. The age of flesh was ending. The symphony of whispers was about to begin, and the honest monsters we knew, they were about to become the least of our fears. The transition was so subtle, so quiet, you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening. The age of flesh had been a roaring fire, a thing of sound and fury. This new age, it arrived like a change in air pressure before a storm, a cold spot in a warm room, a single discordant note in a familiar song. It was a creeping dread that settled in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the screams. We had grown accustomed to the honest, brutal logic of the dead. We knew their rules, but then the rules began to fray at the edges, and a new, terrible kind of illogic began to seep into the world. The symphony of whispers had begun its overture, and we, the last of the living, were its unwilling audience. It started for me in the static. My world is one of sound, of frequencies and wavelengths. I know the rhythm of the empty airwaves, the hiss of a distant storm, the crackle of solar flares. I know the ghost signals that bounce off the ionosphere, faint echoes of broadcasts from half a world away. But this was different. Late at night, when the world was at its quietest, I started hearing patterns in the noise. It wasn't Morse code. It wasn't a voice. It was structure, a cadence, a rhythm that felt deliberate, intelligent. It sounded like whispers, millions of them, all speaking at once from a great distance, their words blurring into a single, hypnotic hum. I'd sit here for hours, headphones pressed tight against my ears, trying to decipher it. I thought I was going mad. I prayed I was going mad. Madness would have been a comfort. The first time I understood what I was dealing with was a night I will carry with me into the silence. I was monitoring the emergency bands. A habit from the old days. A call came through. A small group, maybe a dozen people, holed up in a church in a town called Silver Creek, about 200 miles east of here. The horde was outside, a big one, drawn by the church bells someone had rung in a moment of panicked prayer. They were trapped. Their voices were thin, terrified. They were asking for any clear routes, any sign of military presence, any hope at all. I had nothing to give them. I could only listen. Another helpless ghost in the machine. And then, another voice cut in. The signal was crystal clear, professional. I knew that voice. My God, I knew it. It was a man named David Chen. He was a broadcaster like me, out of a big station in Denver. We'd spoken a few times at conferences back when the world had conferences. He was a good man, a calming presence on the air. His station had gone dark 6 weeks prior. We all assumed the worst. But there he was, his voice calm and authoritative, cut through the static. He said he was with a military remnant, an evacuation convoy. He gave call signs, authentication codes that sounded legitimate. He told the people in the church that a route had been cleared to the old Henderson factory on the east side of their town. He said there were buses waiting, food, medical supplies. He gave them precise directions, street by street. He told them to move now, under the cover of darkness. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope, pure, unadulterated hope. I broke in, my own voice shaking with relief. I confirmed David's identity. I asked about the convoy, about Denver. He answered me. He sounded tired, but he sounded like him. He told me they were setting up a new safe zone, that they were taking back the world, one town at a time. He told me to keep broadcasting, to be a beacon. I relayed the information to the group in the church. I could hear them crying with joy. They thanked me. They thanked David. They said they were going to make a run for it. The last thing I heard was their leader saying, "God bless you. We're on our way." Then their signal went silent, as they left their radio behind. For the next hour, I was ecstatic. I went on the air. I told the story. I played David's transmission. I told our little corner of the world that there was hope, that the cavalry was coming. I felt like a true beacon. Then, about an hour later, a new sound came over the emergency frequency from Silver Creek. It was from the same band the survivors had been using. It was screaming, not human screaming. It was distorted, stretched, layered with that same whispering static I'd been hearing for weeks. And underneath it all, I could hear a voice. David Chen's voice. But it wasn't speaking. It was laughing. A long, slow, triumphant laugh that echoed and twisted in on itself. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a recording, a trophy. That was the day I learned the enemy could lie. That was the day I understood that the whispers in the static were not just noise. They were listening. They were learning, and they were hunting. This new enemy had no body. It had no flesh to tear, no brain to destroy. It existed in the signals, in the air, in the very medium I used to connect with the world. They were a virus of the mind, and my radio was their vector. We started calling them the conductors, because we realized they weren't just a new threat. They were controlling the old one. The zombies, the mindless, shuffling dead. They were becoming puppets. We'd see it from the watchtowers. A horde would be pressing against a wall, a chaotic mess of bodies. Then, one of them would stop. It would lift its head, and a faint violet light would flicker in its dead eyes. And the horde would change. It would move with purpose. It would ignore a weak point in a wall to assault a stronger one, as if it knew something we didn't. They would form complex, coordinated attacks. The dead were no longer just a force of nature. They were an army, and the conductors were their generals. The true war, however, was not fought at the walls. It was fought inside our heads. The symphony of whispers began in earnest. The mimicry became their favorite weapon. They learned voices from old broadcasts, from radio chatter, from the frantic calls of the dying. They'd stand outside a barricaded home at night and whisper, using the voice of a husband who had died weeks before, begging his wife to let him in. They'd use the sound of a crying baby to lure parents out into the dark. They feasted on our love, our attachments. They turned our memories into weapons against us. Then came the paranoia. They would whisper truths. They'd isolate a survivor on guard duty and whisper a secret only one other person in their group could know. A stolen can of food, a secret plan to leave, a past betrayal. They drove wedges between us. They turned fortified communities into powder kegs of suspicion and fear. We saw groups that had survived the age of flesh for years tear themselves apart in a single night, not by zombie bites, but by human hands, all orchestrated by a voice on the wind. My job became impossible. I was a newsman, a purveyor of facts. But what were the facts anymore? If I reported a survivor group's location to offer them aid, was I also revealing them to the conductors? If I broadcast a message of hope, was I creating a voice they could steal and use as a lure? I had to stop reading the names of the dead on air, stop playing memorials, because the moment I did, I was giving the enemy a new mask to wear. I became a censor, a gatekeeper of sorrow. Every word I spoke had to be weighed. Could this be twisted? Could this be used? Could this get someone killed? The broadcast, my life's purpose, had become a minefield. The silence was safer. The silence couldn't be used to lie. We needed a name for them. The conductors felt too neutral, too technical. They were more than that. They were not just intelligent. They were malevolent. They took pleasure in our suffering. They were not creatures of biology. They were a force of pure psychic malice. So we gave them an old name. A name that felt as ancient and as terrible as they did. We called them demons. Not in a biblical sense. Not with horns and pitchforks. But in the classic sense. They were tempters. They were deceivers. They were destroyers of the soul. The war had changed. It was no longer about holding territory or outlasting the dead. That was the war of the body. This was a war of the mind. A battle for the very nature of reality, fought in the whispers of the static and the dark corners of our own hearts. And as I sat here night after night, listening to the symphony of their lies, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was a war we were not equipped to win. Our greatest strengths, our love, our hope, our ability to communicate, had been turned into our most profound vulnerabilities. You cannot understand the end of the world until you understand the nature of the beast that ended it. We thought we were fighting the war on two fronts. We were fools. It was never two wars. It was one war, fought by a single enemy with two bodies, one of flesh, one of whispers, one that devoured the body, and one that devoured the soul. We called it the unholy union. It was the moment the choir learned to sing in harmony, directed by a conductor, whose only desire was the symphony of our extinction. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as anomalies. We were used to the zombies' behavior. They were predictable. They moved like water, flowing towards sound, pulling against obstacles, a mindless tide of hunger. Then we started seeing things that didn't fit the pattern. A survivor group holed up in a shopping mall reported a strange sight. The horde outside wasn't just pressing against the glass doors. A small group of them had separated from the main mass and were methodically, slowly, pushing a burned-out delivery truck towards a weaker service entrance on the side of the building. They moved in unison, their clumsy, shuffling gait now imbued with a shared, terrible purpose. They weren't just flowing, they were thinking, or more accurately, they were being thought for. I remember watching from this very tower, through a pair of high-powered binoculars, as a horde moved across the valley below. For days, they had been stuck at the old Miller's Creek Bridge, a choke point we thought was impassable for them. They would just pile up at the edge, some falling into the ravine, the rest just moaning in place. Then, one afternoon, I saw it change. A single zombie in the center of the horde stopped. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted as if listening to a voice I couldn't hear. A faint, sickly violet light seemed to pulse behind its eyes. A flicker of corrupted data in a dead machine. And then as one, the entire front line of the horde turned away from the bridge. They began to move downstream, along the edge of the ravine. It took them a full day, but they found what they were looking for. A place where a landslide had made the slope less steep. They crossed. They were learning the terrain. They were being guided. The conductor had found its baton. That was the physical manifestation of the Union. The dead, our simple, honest monsters, had become tactical. They were no longer just a plague. They were an infantry deployed with the cold alien intelligence. But the true horror, the true violation, was psychological. It was the way the conductors began to use the bodies not just as tools, but as props in the theater of cruelty. They learned that a moving corpse is terrifying, but a still one can be so much worse. A team from Haven was scavenging a residential neighborhood. They cleared a house, room by room, all clear. As they were leaving, one of them glanced out a back window and saw a single zombie standing in the backyard of the house next door. It wasn't moving, it wasn't moaning, it was just standing there, under a child's swing set, staring at their house. They watched it for an hour. It never moved. It just stood there, a silent, patient sentinel of the damned. They couldn't bring themselves to leave the house. They were paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. Why was it just standing there? What was it waiting for? The psychological pressure was immense. They were supposed to be mindless. This was not mindless. This was a threat display. This was a promise. Then they began to use the dead as messengers. A patrol found the word soon scratched into the dirt outside their gate. The tracks around it were not human. They were the shuffling, dragging tracks of the dead. They had been made to write. The idea that one of those things, one of those shambling bags of rotten meat, had been guided by an unseen hand to trace a word in the mud. It broke something in them. How do you fight an enemy that can turn the very symbols of your language against you? The ultimate expression of this unholy union, the master stroke of their cruelty, was the fusion of the voice and the body. We knew the demons could mimic us. We knew the dead could walk. We never imagined they would do both at the same time. I heard the story from a man named Marcus, a former police officer who was leading a small group in a fortified library. He called me one night, his voice a ragged whisper. He had seen it himself. One of his group, a young woman named Clara, had been taken a week before, bitten on a scavenging run. They had performed the grim ritual, the one mercy left in this world. They all saw her die. The next night, they saw her again. She was part of the horde outside the library doors, but she wasn't shuffling or moaning. She was standing at the front of the pack, her body still, her head tilted, and a voice came from the air around her. Her voice, Clara's voice. It wasn't coming from her mouth. Her jaw was slack broken. The voice was just there, a disembodied echo clinging to her corpse. And it spoke to Marcus. It called him by name. It said, "Marcus, I am cold. Please let me in." Don said, "You remember what you promised? You promised you'd folders, always keep me safe." It was a perfect fusion of hells. The physical proof of your failure, the reanimated body of your friend, standing right there, and the psychic attack, the voice of a demon wearing her memory, speaking her deepest fears, and your own deepest guilt. How do you fight that? Do you shoot the body? You're just shooting a puppet. The voice just laughs. Do you ignore it? How do you ignore the voice of someone you loved, begging you for help, even when you know it's a lie? This was the true purpose of the unholy union. It was designed to shatter our will to survive. It systematically dismantled every rule we had built our defenses around. Rule 1. They are mindless. That was the first to go. Now they were a thinking army. Rule 2. They are slow. Individually, yes, but as a group guided by a demonic intelligence, they could set traps, lay ambushes, and patiently maneuver for weeks to exploit a single weakness. Rule 3. Silence is safety. A beautiful lie. Now the silence was when the whispers came. And what good was staying quiet when a demon could make a corpse outside your wall scream your name all night long, drawing every zombie for miles? Rule 4. Fortify your position. A wall is only as strong as the minds of the people defending it. The demons didn't need to break down our walls. They whispered their way through the cracks in our sanity. They made us believe our leaders were compromised. Our neighbors were thieves, our loved ones were demons in disguise. They made us turn the guns on ourselves. The world was no longer a physical battlefield. It had become a haunted house the size of a planet. Every corpse was a potential puppet. Every shadow was a potential spy. Every broadcast, every radio wave was a potential weapon to be used against us. Hope became a vulnerability. Love became a vector for infection. The very things that made us human were now the tools of our destruction. I sit here now in this concrete tomb on top of a lonely mountain, and I listen to the choir outside. But I hear it differently now. It's not just a mindless chorus of groans. I can hear the structure. I can hear the movements, the pauses, the shifts in intensity. It's not random. It's music. A terrible, patient, hungry music. And I know with a certainty that has settled deep in my bones that somewhere out there in the swirling snow and the violet-tinged darkness, the conductor is raising its baton, ready for the final crescendo. Hope is a stubborn weed. It can grow in the most barren soil, in the darkest of places. For a long time, my hope had a name. It was called Haven. Haven was a town about 80 miles west of here, nestled in a river valley. It was one of the last, a fortress of ingenuity and sheer bloody-minded determination. They had done everything right. They had high walls, hydroponic farms, a small working hydroelectric dam. They had a community. They had a future. And they had a voice. Her name was Sarah. She ran their community radio, a small, low-wattage station operating out of the old town hall. We found each other by accident, two lonely signals crossing in the night. For more than a year, she was my only real contact with what was left of the human race. Her voice? It was everything mine wasn't. It was clear, strong, relentlessly optimistic. While I reported on the encroaching darkness, she spoke of harvests, of new babies being born, of plans for the future. She would read poems written by the children of Haven. She would play music from an old acoustic guitar. She was the voice of a world I was desperate to believe still existed. We were two lighthouses, calling to each other across a sea of static, proving to ourselves and to anyone else who might be listening that we were not alone. The end of Haven didn't come from the outside. The choir had been at their walls for years, a constant, manageable threat. No, the end came from a whisper. It came from a single conductor, a demon of singular patience and artistry. It began with a disagreement, a simple human thing. A scavenging team had found a small cache of antibiotics, a treasure more valuable than gold. The debate in Haven was how to distribute them. Should they be for the children, the soldiers guarding the walls, the workers on the farms? Sarah told me about it. It was a tense situation, but they were working through it. They were a community. They would find a solution. Then the whisper started. The demon didn't need to shout. It just needed to find the cracks. It began whispering to the guards on the wall, telling them the council was planning to withhold the medicine from their families. It whispered to the farmers that the soldiers saw them as expendable. It found a woman who had recently lost her husband to a zombie bite and whispered to her in his voice, telling her that the town's doctor could have saved him but chose not to. Sarah's broadcasts began to change. The optimism was still there, but it was strained, forced. She started broadcasting messages of unity, pleading with her people to remember who the real enemy was. But she was trying to shout over a symphony of paranoia. I could hear the fear in her voice. She told me about the arguments in the town square, the fistfights, the accusations. People they had known their whole lives were suddenly looking at each other with suspicion and hatred. The community was turning septic. The demon sep's masterstroke was subtle. It never told anyone to commit violence. It just fed their fear. It just asked questions. Are you sure you can trust him? Did you see the way she looked at you? What are they doing with the medicine while you sleep? The fall came on a Tuesday. I remember because Sarah and I always had our longest conversation on Tuesday nights. She didn't answer my call. Instead, her station crackled to life with a frantic open broadcast. It was her. Her voice was stripped of all its strength, raw with terror. She was in her radio booth, the door barricaded. She was describing what was happening outside. It wasn't the dead. It was the living. Neighbor was fighting neighbor. The guards had abandoned the walls to protect their own. Fires were burning in the hydroponic farms. The last broadcast from Haven was 10 minutes long. For the first 9, Sarah pleaded with her people. She told them they were being manipulated, that a lie had poisoned them. She named the demon, called it out, trying to expose it. But it was too late. The choir, the ever-patient choir, had found the unmanned gates. They were pouring into the town, a tide of death drawn to the sounds of Haven tearing itself apart. The final minute of the broadcast. I will hear it until the silence takes me. Sarah went quiet for a moment. I could hear shouting and the splintering of wood in the background. Then her voice came back, no longer shouting, but a dead, hollow whisper. It wasn't for her people anymore. It was for me. Elias, she said, her voice impossibly calm. It's in their heads. It turned us into the monsters. Don't let it use your hope against you. It's a weapon. Hope is a weapon. There was a loud crash. The sound of her booth door giving way. She screamed. It was a short, terrible sound. It was followed by the sound of human voices, not demonic whispers, but the enraged shouts of her own people. Then there was only the sound of the horde, the triumphant final note of the choir. I stayed on the frequency for hours. Days. I called her name into the void, but there was only static. The second lighthouse had gone dark, and in that silence, I finally understood. The demons didn't need to destroy us. They just needed to whisper the right words and we would destroy ourselves. Heaven didn't fall to a siege. It died of a fever of the soul. That was the day my hope died. It wasn't a weed, it was a flower, and I had watched the last one on earth be trampled into the mud. And so, the story is told. The history of the end. I suppose there's nothing left to say now. The generator is making a new sound, a rattling, choking noise. The old girl has finally run out of fuel. The lights on my console are beginning to flicker, each one a dying star in my own private constellation. The end of the broadcast is here. The end of the signal. The silence is coming for me now. It's funny. For years I've been afraid of that silence. But now it almost feels like a relief. A release. There are no more stories to tell. No more warnings to give. The book is closed. The choir outside is louder than it's ever been. A wall of sound. 1,000 wretched voices pressed against the concrete. But it's not just them anymore. The conductors have arrived. The whispers are no longer just a ghost in the static. They are here. They are in the room with me. Little zephyrs of cold air touching my face. The scent of ozone and cold, damp earth. They are whispering my name. Elias. A soft, sibilant hiss that seems to come from everywhere at once. Elias. It's time to be quiet now. There is a scratching at the door. Not the clumsy, mindless pounding of the dead. This is a delicate, deliberate sound, like a single fingernail, impossibly long and sharp, tracing patterns in the reinforced steel. They're not trying to break it down. Not yet. They are savoring this. They are artists, in their own terrible way, and this is their grand finale. I am not afraid. The fear was burned out of me a long time ago, on a Tuesday night listening to the static from a town called Haven. All that's left is a profound and endless weariness. I feel like a man who has been walking for 1,000 years and has finally seen a place to sit down. So as promised, I will end this broadcast and everything else with a lullaby. One final piece of music for a world that has already fallen asleep. It's a piece by a man named Eric Satie. He wrote it a long, long time ago, in a world that had no idea what kind of monsters were waiting in the wings. It's calm. It's gentle. It is a sound of acceptance. It is the sound of letting go. To anyone who might find this recording, a ghost listening in a future I cannot imagine, know that we were here. We lived. We fought. We were not just a prelude to your silence. And Sarah, wherever you are, I hope you can hear this. This one is for you, for Haven, for all of us. Good night.